Hello, and welcome to Project Merlin, the podcast about the darkest secrets in Britain's history. I'm investigative journalist Susie Boniface, and together with the University of Liverpool, I'm delving into the biggest ever declassification of nuclear records to get closer to the truth that lies behind decades of government cover-up. Now, today, I'm being joined by two brilliant men, both lawyers, don't let that put you off, who between them have bookended this sort of legal fight for justice for the nuclear veterans. So first, Neil Sampson, who was lead solicitor for the firm Rosenblatts on a High Court claim for negligence brought against the MOD in 2007, I think, wasn't it, Neil?
Yes.
Yeah. And Oli Troen, who's solicitor for McHugh Jury, a previous guest in the podcast, and they're doing the groundwork now for a new case over a programme of medical experiments on troops, which have since come to light. Morning, Oli.
Morning.
So I'm flying solo again because Dr. John Hogg, my co-host, can't be with us. As always, we have to say that the interpretations and opinions expressed on this podcast will differ. They are the personal views of individual guests, and they do not necessarily reflect the position of the University of Liverpool. So let's start then. So our listeners, Neil, will already know a little bit about Project Merlin and the Merlin database and our efforts to decode some of that at the university. But it was the case that you led that was the cause of Merlin being created, the inspiration, whatever you want to call it. Can you explain to our listeners what that case was about, how you went about it, how it led to the creation of Merlin?
Well, try to. It's a long story. Thousands of veterans took part in the nuclear tests in Australia and the South Pacific in the 50s and 60s. They very quickly realised they were suffering ill effects, medical problems as a result of having taken part. And over the years, many people tried making claims against the British government for the injuries they had suffered. And the answer from the government always was, no, you cannot have been injured by taking part in these tests because there was no radiation, or there was no radiation of a level sufficient to cause any harm to you. We were very careful to protect you. British prime ministers, including Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, wrote letters to veterans groups saying effectively that nobody was hurt in these tests, but if there could ever be if there could ever be evidence that showed there was a link between exposure to radiation and the medical problems that people were suffering, the government would deal with their claims. Nobody could ever really prove it until sometime, I can't remember the date, I'm sorry to say, but a guy called Professor Rowland in New Zealand did a study.
That was 2007 that it got published, but it was working that in the years before, yeah.
Yes, it was done earlier than that. He did some tests on chromosome aberrations, which proved to his satisfaction and most other people's satisfaction, other than the British government, that there was a link between exposure to radiation and the diseases that veterans were suffering. And around that time, the British government had agreed to fund claims by the veterans through the legal aid system. And they said, well, we don't think you've got a claim, but legal aid is available, and lawyers were instructed to act on the basis of cover for costs by the government under the legal aid system. As soon as the Rowland report came out, the legal aid department suddenly decided this case has no merit, we're going to discontinue the legal aid cover. So the veterans no longer had lawyers being paid, and lawyers are mean and nasty people, so no money, no work, effectively.
So the moment the veterans had some kind of genetic connection to their illnesses, some kind of proof, even if you wanted to argue about the value of that proof, they had something that could have been used in a court case that could have made a court case more likely, you'd have thought, to go their way. That's the point that legal aid was withdrawn.
That's right, yes.
How marvellous.
It's a very strange decision. Mine not to reason why. But the veterans group then they decided they wanted to fight on with the case, and they looked for a law firm. And my law firm decided we would back the case and agreed to take it on what is effectively called a no-win, no-fee basis. We would fund it if the claim was successful and the government had to pay the legal cost. We would be paid. If the case failed, we wouldn't be paid. And we took the case on in around 2007. All was well. We had the Rowland report and the case proceeded. And it went through all the various steps that litigation does. There was a detailed statement of claim prepared, which relied to a large degree on the Rowland study, the Rowland report, that there was a link between chromosomal damage and exposure to radiation, and that damage to men's chromosomes would affect not only their own health, but would go on to affect subsequent generations, the children, grandchildren of the veterans. Mm-hmm. The government decided they would take a limitation defence. Under the general law, if you have a claim for personal injury, which is what this case is really all about, you can only bring it if you bring the case within 3 years of the injury or 3 years of you knowing that you've got an injury. So in this case, people develop cancer 10 years after exposure during the tests. Their 3-year time would run from that date. So the government argued that it was all too late to bring the case. Having said, from number 10 down, if you can ever prove it, please tell us and we'll deal with it. As soon as we could prove it, they said, oh, no, sorry, you're too late. You should have done this years ago.
And this was 2007 would have been, 60, 50, 55 years, 55 years since the first bond test. And so the MOD argument was that the people they would want to talk to be their witnesses were long since dead, because they were people who were quite senior in the 50s and 60s. They would have been in their 40s then, and they weren't around any longer. And that lots of the evidence and detail about it were on bits of paper, which may not have been kept. And it was too late. How can we possibly defend ourselves? Which is, I suppose, that's why you have the limitation defence, isn't it? It's why you say you've got to do it within 3 years.
That's right. So, but there is an exception under the Limitation Act that if there is good reason not to have brought the case before, then the court can use its discretion and allow you to proceed with the case. And that's what the trial that we had in the High Court was really about. And Mr. Justice Foskett heard the what is called the limitation trial. He heard that and decided that, yes, we were then acting for 1,011 veterans or their families, for those who had died. He decided that there was good reason why the claim could not have been brought earlier and all the claims should proceed. There's about 111 of the claims that could have proceeded anyway, because they were people who'd been diagnosed very recently with diseases. So about 111 people could proceed in any event. But Mr. Justice Foskett, in a very well argued judgment, said this case needs to be dealt with. And he granted leave for the case to proceed.
Yeah, he said it would be unfair for some of the veterans to have their day in court and not the others. And he said I'm gonna give them all the benefit of the doubt, let them go and argue it out in court. So once you'd had the limitation argument and you'd settled that in High Court, then in theory you could go to a full trial on the facts, when Rowland would then be brought in, and then you could argue about the genetics and all the rest of it. And Merlin then was sort of created as the disclosure exercise in this case. So Oli, you're a young whippersnapper about town. And know all about the very current, most latest recent rules. Whenever I used to think about legal disclosure, I thought about that scene in The Name of the Father, when Emma Thompson, as the solicitor Gareth Pearce, she's trying to get the Birmingham Six off and proving that they've been victims of a cover-up. And she suddenly pulls out of her briefcase a piece of paper that proves they knew all along the confessions were falsified, and you must do this. And there's uproar in the court, and we never saw this. What's going on? The idea that lawyers have to share information with the other side long before you get there means you wouldn't have any of those dramatic Hollywood moments, and half these novels and films would never get made. So what are the real rules? What are you supposed to do when the MOD, if you're the MOD and you're going to court against Neil, what do you do to prepare for it?
Well, I think the first thing to say, Susie, is that reference probably goes way over the head of most of your listeners who are Liverpool University students. So I won't say anything.
Go and watch the film, everyone. It's fantastic.
It's even gone over my head. So I'll say nothing else about that reference. The disclosure rules are really simple in the English High Court. We have what's called cards on the table litigation disclosure, which means that both sides are required to undertake reasonable and proportionate searches, identify relevant documents, be they positive for their case or adverse to their case, and disclose them to the court and to the other side. The process is managed by solicitors working with their clients. So the aim of that is that as lawyers, we also have duties to the court to ensure that documents are disclosed to the court where they are relevant. And what that means is there's a check on a client, for example, in this example, the MOD or the nuclear test veterans, deciding what to provide to the court and saying, that's it, or at least that's how it should work in theory.
Right. So you have to just put everything out there. And I suppose the idea is that if you know what the other side's got in advance, you might be able to avoid the litigation altogether. Because you go, they've got proof, we're done, kind of thing, and we don't need to waste the money all the time.
Exactly. It's to try to short circuit the court process by saying we're going to have to give up absolutely everything we've got here. And if we're sitting on something which says, oh, we actually did do something wrong here, then you would know not to bring the case in the first place. The second aspect of it is to help the court. So the judge will want to have all of the documents and all of the information in front of them when they're hearing argument and making a decision, so that it's a level playing field.
And what happens, I mean, is it ever the case that perhaps a theoretically very large organisation with a theoretically infinite amount of money would say, well, we can fight a long case, we don't care about the costs, maybe we'll be a bit cute about the disclosure? Is it ever possible to go, no, maybe not?
In theory, it shouldn't be, but in practice, it is, and parties do it. There are some fairly strong rules around doing it, and lawyers can be in breach of their obligations to the court, and the client, the defendant or the claimant in this circumstance, can be in breach of their duty to the court, and the court takes those breaches really, really seriously. That's not to say it doesn't happen, and the court doesn't have a huge amount of powers that it can use to go behind a disclosure exercise. A lot of it is done in, whilst not good faith, a belief that the parties are acting in compliance with their obligations. And that is a problem with the English court system, is that we can't look behind what's going on behind closed doors in order to understand what has actually gone on, unless you're able to pull the whole process apart, which with something like this is really, really difficult.
Yeah. Unless, for example, someone were to publish all the disclosure documents 20 years later and someone can start combing through them. So it kind of seems to rely a little bit on kind of everyone being a gentleman in a sort of very archaic English law.
Which is not out of character with sort of the English court system.
No, it strikes me as that. So Neil, is this case progressed then, as you were going through it? I remember sitting in that limitation trial in the High Court where I first met you, and sitting alongside lots of veterans on those public benches who are sadly no longer with us. And you were having lots of arguments with the MOD about the information that was coming out. They said the nature of what you were asking for was highly classified, really secure stuff, very sensitive. It's about nuclear weapons. We can't just publish this stuff willy-nilly. And most people listening to this might think, well, yeah, nuclear weapons, absolutely fine. Of course, that should be secret. But what you were asking for shouldn't really ever have been classified, is it? Because the issues about personal injury are not something that really needs anyone to know what the recipe for making a nuclear weapon is.
Precisely. An argument I had often with the government's lawyers. I could understand, we didn't want to see the blueprints for an atomic bomb. What we wanted to know was what radiation was recorded as having fallen on the ground, fallen on the men. When black clouds drifted across Maralinga or Montebello, what caused that? We knew what caused it. It was the atomic bombs. But what was the level of radiation that people were exposed to? And one of the questions that was very relevant, to go back to the procedure a little, that Oli was talking about, the parties have to serve what are called disclosure statements and disclosure lists to tell the opposition what documents they've got and effectively how they found them. And there is a man called Geoffrey Mitchell, who was a senior lawyer in the Treasury solicitors or in the MOD, who was responsible for putting the documents together. And he started that process in 2004 when the MOD was first given notice of the likelihood that this claim was going to happen, which eventually happened in 2007. And he formed a committee to gather together all the documents, because, of course, the government is a very large organisation and there are many different departments involved. And what Mr. Mitchell did, as he told us in his witness statement that he served on at the court, was he prepared a guidance note for the various departments who were being asked to provide documents. And that guidance note was actually a very good note. It covered a lot of things that were very relevant. For example, medical studies conducted by the MOD or other organisations prior to the 1950s to date to prove or disprove a link between exposure to radiation and taking part in the tests. Now, that's highly relevant, but very little was ever disclosed. And we know that they had lots of medical records. They were asked to disclose all the monitoring records that they had. They wanted to know what guidance was given to participants before and after the tests as to what damage they were likely to suffer. Now, none of that was disclosed. They all said it was not relevant. Mr. Mitchell, I think, was right in his initial approach, but as they began getting the documents together for disclosure, what I think happened was they realised they got an awful lot of stuff that wasn't very helpful. Now, Oli said a few moments ago that you have to disclose documents which are helpful and those which are not helpful. And that, I think, is where the government got into trouble or is in trouble, because they failed to disclose documents which they had, which are now coming to light a lot, Susie, thanks to your efforts. But things are coming out now that were never disclosed to us in the litigation, that proved it was known that there was likely to be damage. I mean, there's a quote, I can't remember it precisely, but William Penny was going to Australia as part of the tests. William Penny, I'm sure your listeners will know, was the man in charge of the whole process. And it was proposed to put out a press release which said there was limited risk of exposure or limited fallout. And he wrote back and said, no, I prefer to say there was no fallout. Well, the person who drafted his original press release must have known that there was fallout, or else he wouldn't have put it in there in the first place. And the fact that Sir William, as he became, changed the wording demonstrates, in my mind, the fact that there was a cover-up which started in the 1950s and carries on today.
Yeah. So this guidance note that Mitchell created, there were 12 different points on it, the things they were looking for. And it was like, it basically formed a huge, I suppose it's right to describe it as a huge kind of net that was sort of trawled all the way through Whitehall, all the way through these government departments and different agencies that had obviously changed over the years, just to scoop up everything that might be relevant to the main thrust of a personal injury claim, which I always remember by the acronym RISK. So there was stuff about information about radiation, information about injury, information about safety, and knowledge, the institutional knowledge of what was happening to these men at the time. Because I think most people probably always thought that if this kind of thing went on, that, you know, they didn't really know what they were doing, is usually the explanation. So these 12 points covered that. And there was even a 13th point in his guidance note, which says, oh, and anything else you find that might be interesting, kind of thing. Whack it all in. So they've scooped everything up. We now know that a lot of that stuff would have been really pertinent and of use. I think I can recall you talking about at the time the difficulty you had in actually physically getting to any of these documents. Did you have a copy of the Merlin database on a nice secure computer that you could type in some keywords and just pull all this stuff out?
No. What we got was what I think is known as mini Merlin, which was effectively a hard drive, which they gave to us. We got a list of 12,500 documents they were disclosing, and a document could be 100 pages long. I mean, it was an enormous process. And we had 34 people working for a year to go through all of these documents, to read them all. What happened when Mini Merlin arrived was we opened it, but couldn't read anything. And it made no sense. And we couldn't search anything. And it just didn't work. And after a few days, we talked to the Treasury solicitor about it, and they spoke to their IT specialist, and we had an IT specialist on the job. And it was then discovered that because they had encrypted the database that was sent to us, that wiped out the ability to search it at all. So they provided us with a new database, which I don't remember whether it wasn't encrypted or they changed it somehow. And we use, as many law firms do, proprietary document handling systems where you can search them. But because of the way the MOD produced Mini Merlin, we couldn't use that system to search the database. And there was days, if not weeks, spent trying to work it out, because they label documents grapple 2, for example. And that covered 1,000 documents, perhaps. And so, but what is it? What is that document called grapple 2? So you've then got to get into that document, and you've got to know the right codes to get into it and the right numbers to insert. And initially, the system required very long identification codes to be inserted for each document, which Word, we use Word, the computer program, couldn't accept search terms that were that long. And it was a painful task, which cost a lot of money in terms of our staff having to work long hours for weeks trying to get through the system. And it was hopeless, and call me old-fashioned if you will, but I like the good old way where we used to get a photocopied file, a bundle of documents. Now this bundle would have been quite big, but it would have been so much easier. I mean, I should perhaps say that one of the barrister who represented the MOD originally in the matter, he's not the man who was carried on at the trial, but at a preliminary hearing, he said they have a warehouse full of documents. And what we got was 12,500. Well, you need a pretty small warehouse to fill it with 12,500 documents. I suspect there were, and there are, hundreds of thousands of documents, if not more.
Yeah. Well, we know now the Merlin, when you said it take 34 people a year to go through these 12,500 on mini Merlin as it was, we now know that was about a third of the total that was on Merlin. We've got 28,000 documents and I've got about half a dozen students and me. So I think it's going to take me longer than a year to go through it. But we are finding interesting stuff on there. But there were these tags, weren't there? So the documents were supposed to be tagged with keywords. And I can remember there being discussions about you could supply the MOD with the keywords you wish, search terms you wish to search for. They would go off and type it in and search it on their computer, and they would then produce the document. But you couldn't necessarily have a copy of the document if it was high security. You had to go to the MOD and get locked in a secret room with it, didn't you?
Well, yes. Well, it was only in 2008 that they raised the question of many of the documents being high security and not disclosable, or not disclosable unless we were locked in a room, as you say. They also suggested that we all get developed vetting status to see the highest level. I actually did get developed vetting clearance later in relation to war pension appeal cases, but we're not dealing with them at the moment. But it takes months to get security clearance.
Development vetting is the level of security classification that like a minister would have, a government minister, that they get sort of automatically by being a minister. But if you're going to work as, for example, the Prime Minister's, right-hand man, chief of staff, you get developed vetting because you're seeing very, very high security, very, very current stuff. So they were asking a lot, I think, to ask for some solicitors who were looking at very historic bits of paper to go through jump through that same hoop. It's a very high hurdle, isn't it?
It is. And it was nonsensical in relation to the timing that we were talking then in the summer of 2008, and the trial was due to begin in January 2009. And it could take 6 months for the vetting process to be concluded. So it was just never going to happen. And we raised complaint with them that they were raising this in the summer of 2008. They had never mentioned it before. There were a number of hearings, preliminary hearings. Nobody said anything about documents being highly classified. And I have to say that at risk of getting myself into terrible trouble, I would say, having seen highly classified documents, they're a bit like the shopping list to go to Sainsbury's. I cannot possibly see what high security factor attaches to many of the documents. And as I said earlier, I'm not interested in seeing blueprints for the bombs. It's the effect of them. And if the effect of the bombs is a matter of high security, that could only be, well, there are two reasons. One, they didn't work, so there was no radiation. Therefore, the whole thing was a waste of time.
No, yep.
Or the amount of radiation was so high that they didn't want anybody to know that they'd actually got a super bomb. And in fact, on a couple of the tests, I think the yield of the explosions was much higher than they ever expected. So, but whatever it is, there should have been no document dealing with the level to which veterans were exposed should have been hidden. It really needed to be disclosed. And, regrettably...
The government said at the time, the government lawyers, which I feel like I'm doing a lot of advocation on their part today, but the government lawyers at the time said they'd done everything they could. The disclosure rules are not about disclosing absolutely everything you have. It's about being reasonable and proportionate. If you have a lot of documents, you just got to make good efforts to tell people as much as possible. They would say they've done the best they could. It's all lots of old paperwork. They scanned this all into Merlin on PDFs. They've done their utmost, and they've had teams of barristers working on it and everything else. Oli, at the time, it seems that the judge kind of just said okay and accepted Neil's arguments that there was stuff they were not getting, but also accepted the arguments from the MOD that they'd done their best and they'd followed the rules and they were behaving like gentlemen. Is it normal? I suppose they come down in the end on the government's side and said, no, this is you've done a good job in terms of disclosure, I think. So is it normal, I suppose, that a judge would perhaps give the benefit of the doubt to the government in that kind of argument rather than the claimant who's, like Neil, some young punk lawyer who's coming along causing trouble?
Well, they shouldn't do, but you know how these things are. You get a preeminent Queen's Counsel, as it was then, standing up in front of a judge who, they've known for a long time and telling them that they've reviewed this and all of it has been done very properly and everything that matters has been disclosed. It's not unusual for judges to accept those arguments because, judges don't want to get bogged down in arguments over disclosure. They want to try and get to the issue and get the case dealt with and get it off their desk. What that often means is that you don't have full disclosure and it opens a gap for parties to be able to control the process to their advantage. I'd say two things on what Neil has just been talking about. The first one is that the other thing to remember with developed vetting is that it's incredibly personally intrusive. And by asking lawyers, and it would need to be Neil and his full team to do that, not only are you asking that at the last minute, having never raised it before, but you're also asking them to put their whole lives on show to the people from the developed vetting agency. And that's another tactic, I think, that the government uses to put pressure on claimants and their legal teams. The second thing with Merlin is what the judge is seeing and what's being argued over, and what Neil was seeing is the second or even the third stage of the production of Merlin. So the first two stages of that, which is bringing all the documents together and deciding which documents should be handed over to Neil in the form of mini Merlin, the MOD marks its own homework on both of those. And so you have this situation where the AWE and the MOD are working in tandem to produce these databases, but nobody has any insight behind the curtain to how they were actually doing that. And as you can see, when you're marking your own homework, you give yourself 10 out of 10 for work which is far below that standard.
Yeah, and if the head teacher says, well, have you done the work properly? You say, yes, I definitely did all my homework and I was there for half an hour and I really worked hard at it. And you don't need to see it to know that. I'm just being honest.
And I should say, Susie, and this is another part of the problem, is that the legal team of the claimants, of which we're often a part of, which I know Neil has great experience, they often complain about deficient disclosure. Part of our job is to say they haven't given us everything, and to push and push and push again. And that means, in cases like this, where there genuinely has been a really deficient disclosure exercise, it can sometimes look like, well, the claimant always complains about disclosure. Let's have a look at what we've got and go from there.
Yeah, it was very much, I suppose, a sort of a bog standard argument, but over a massive, massive pile of documents, which you weren't even arguing about access to the full pile. You're just arguing for access to a third of it. And it would seem, I mean, we're not quite sure which documents were on Mini Merlin now and on Merlin itself. It's kind of hard to tell so many years on, but it does seem that not everything was on there that should have been on there. So the MOD was arguing at the time that they've scanned these things, they've logged them, they've catalogued them, they've given them all keywords. It's all been done in the spirit of openness and gentlemanly disclosure. But that's not what we've been finding at Liverpool on our project. So one file we've discussed previously on the podcast had every single page removed for security reasons and no keywords logged. So you couldn't find it even if you'd gone looking for that specific file. I mean, there was one document I saw yesterday, which was the cover sheet saying this is a top secret file. It's not allowed. Don't remove any pages from this file. And then the rest of the file is missing. It hasn't been put in. And, when the National Archives now they're getting Merlin from the Atomic Weapons Establishment, the AWE, and they're digitizing it all and putting out 500 files a week and so on and so forth. They're logging what the keywords were for each document. And I cannot tell you how many of them, the keywords are not specified. That is the key word. Or that they were never there in the first place. So some of these, it was impossible to find. Some, it just appears, the whole thing, that it was kind of built on a Friday afternoon by people who had finished their work for the week and were busy doing something else. And more than one archivist, not a specialist necessarily, people who were dipping in, trying to get the work done while they were doing other things, because public sector budgets were such that they didn't have anyone absolutely dedicated to this one task. They were getting people to do it while they were doing other things. And the list of search terms that we used to sift the database as well, that's though they had, when the government were actually presenting some of this stuff onto Mini Merlin and then presented to the court, they were using more search terms to sift this, was their words, in order to find the stuff that was relevant. But the sifting itself seems to have been a way of sort of holding stuff back rather than letting things through the net. It's just an extra net to catch a few things. And there's, on the sifting rules that we've got from some of the court documents at the time, which mercifully I managed to keep, they provided to the MOD that there was no mention of blood, there's no mention of urine, there's no mention of experimentation, for example. So it would have been hard to find some of those bits of evidence that we now have about a mass medical monitoring program of the troops. We found photos that are tagged with the word Maralinga in the outback in South Australia, but they're a Pacific island and a bomb going up, and it's clearly a hydrogen weapon because it's absolutely massive, and it's clearly Christmas Island. So we've got things called Operation Buffalo when it's Operation Grapple. We've got duplications, partial files, letters about reports that they're discussing, but you don't actually know where the report is. The titles don't mix with each other. They're not linked to one another. And quite a few files we've discussed in previous episodes. So information about British involvement in the Cincinnati radiation experiments on humans, information that showed fallout at Operation Totem and the Black Mist was worse than that at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Explicitly stated experiments being conducted on personnel. You've got urine observations at Hurricane, thyroid counting, awareness of the genetic hazards, and so on. I know it's a while ago, Neil, but I was reporting on this case at the time. You were acting on behalf of the veterans, and when you could, releasing information to the media and others about where you were on the case and so on. I feel like, had you known this stuff, had you had those kind of documents about urine experiments and thyroid testing, I feel like you would have mentioned it.
Yes. We would.
It's not something that would have just slipped under your radar and gone, oh, well, that's just another big bit of paper in all the big pile of paper.
Well, you're quite right. When we came to the Court of Appeal, because the government appealed Mr. Justice Foskett's decision to allow all the claims to proceed, the Court of Appeal kept asking us, our counsel, what level of radiation were the men exposed to? And we said, well, we can't tell you that because we don't have the documents that will disclose or will show what the level of radiation was. And there was then a major argument because we said we just don't have the documents. And Charles Gibson QC, who was the barrister representing the government, said, well, that's nonsense. He said, we have disclosed absolutely everything. And he said he had a team, I think, of 15 barristers working for months to make sure that everything had been disclosed. And being a little technical, we were in a limitation trial, and therefore the disclosure was supposedly about limitation. And the judge asked him if they had disclosed everything. And he said, yes, not just limited to the limitation issues, but for the entire action. And he asserted to the court that they disclosed everything. I took objection to that. And I, together with my team, worked overnight to prepare a witness statement for the court to show that what Gibson said just was not true. We handed that statement to the court the following day, expecting the court to be a little agitated about it. But as Oli has just said, it's easier for the judge to say, well, we're not going to get involved. And that's precisely what Lady Justice Smith said in her judgment for the in the Court of Appeal. They said, she said something like, I know there is a dispute about disclosure, but we're not going to get involved. So, but it was quite wrong in my view, because the court asks, what level of exposure did the men suffer, or was there? And we said, well, we can't tell you that because we don't have the documents from the measurements that were taken to show that, the blood test, the urine test, and everything else. And so we couldn't answer her question. And she said, well, I'm not going to get involved in matters about disclosure of documents. It's quite wrong, because that's what we needed. And I'd like to rerun the case today with the documents that have now become available. And I think the result would be very different.
Yeah. So we had this case it was 2009, I think, Foskett handed down his judgment that said everyone had their right to a day in court. Then, there was a moment on the High Court steps. I remember I rushed across the road and bought a couple of bottles of champagne from the nearest pub and went back, and all the veterans and widows were on the steps, and I sprayed champagne all over them, and they were having a whale of a time. And then there was sort of a period of, well, crikey, now what? The veterans have won the limitation argument. That it should now go to a full trial. There will be huge costs to the government. There's genetic evidence. Surely they're going to settle at this point. But that didn't happen. Instead, they went to the Court of Appeal. They appealed the judgment, and then you appealed that judgment, which went against you, up to the Supreme Court. And then the veterans kind of lost again there finally. But what was happening in that sort of those dog days between the High Court case and that successful moment where we thought everything was on the way, and the fact when they started lodging the appeals?
Well, in his judgment, Mr. Justice Foskett finished his formal judgment by saying something like, this case needs to settle. I do not want these elderly people who have suffered so much for so long to have to go through a High Court trial, which is going to take another 2 or 3 years. I want the parties to get together and settle it. So a day or two later, once I'd had my suit dry cleaned to get the champagne off it, I wrote to the Treasury solicitors and said, Mr. Justice Foskett wants us to talk. I've got a small team here that will negotiate on behalf of the veterans. Who will you put forward for your team? And they didn't reply for a few days. And I think I chased them, and they wrote back and said, we are not going to negotiate. And then a little later, they said they would negotiate barrister to barrister, which is quite unusual, really, in a case such as this. So we agreed that our barrister could meet with Charles Gibson, their barrister, and see what came of it. And they had a meeting, and Ben Brown came back to the Rosenblatt office, and he said, well, they're prepared to make an offer, but only on the terms that if they tell us what the offer is, if we accept it, that will be fine. But if we reject it, we mustn't tell our clients what the offer is. And they would not make an offer until we had agreed to their terms. And there was no way.
Secret negotiation, in other words, a secret that the solicitors would agree between themselves, or the barristers would agree between themselves, what the deal would be. Why does that not fly?
Because I wasn't going to get struck off as a solicitor. I've managed to evade such problems all my life. It's wholly unprofessional for a solicitor to be given information about the case that he does not tell his client about. We could not agree to be in possession of information that we could not tell our clients about, particularly when it affected them so much as settling their case or not settling their case. So we simply said, we can't accept those terms. Either you tell us, or you don't.
And if you had accepted those terms, there would have been huge regulatory ramifications.
Yes,
for you, for the firm, it would be it's unworkable.
Absolutely. I would have been struck off. I think the barristers would probably have been disbarred as well. It's completely wrong. And the government lawyers then waited until the very last day. You have 3 months to file an appeal, and they waited till the last day to file their appeal of that, the Foskett decision.
Right.
It was quite wrong and very manipulative, and we've had all sorts of difficulties which go way beyond the scope, I think, of this discussion, with things being said in the House of Commons which were false.
Yeah, so there were discussions, I think probably to sum it up, so there were discussions in Parliament about what was happening with the case, because there were MPs then as now who are very interested in it. And the minister at the time, who was a Veterans Minister, chap called Kevin Jones, stood up and said that he had agreed a range of figures, of assessment figure, and that it had been rejected. And you objected to that at the time, I can remember quite strongly. Yeah. I've done FOIs since then and tried to find out what this settlement figure was and what happened to it and where the process went. And it's been quite difficult getting those answers out of the government legal department and the Ministry of Defence, because they say but it's still an active case. What? Well, yes, it is, but in theory. But I mean, come on. And their response was that an offer was passed to the lawyers for the veterans, but the indication was that it would never be it would never be recommended to the veterans for acceptance, and so therefore it never really got anywhere. And the government's line, which again I seem to be advocating for, is that the offer was blocked in some way by your firm, and your suggestion is that very much that the way it was offered to you was in a way that it couldn't even be heard without everyone losing their jobs.
That's exactly basically. Right.
Yeah.
They have never put forward an offer. And there was an instance where Member of Parliament Andrew Robertson, who was the Minister for Veterans at the time, made a statement.
Robertson.
Indeed, he got his peerage soon after this. He made a statement in the House which was completely false. And I complained to the Cabinet Ethics Department under the Ministerial Code. He should put it right or resign. And I dealt with a lady called Sue Gray, who was head of the Ethics Department.
Who's she?
She's been in the news more recently for other matters. But she said to me, well, what the minister said in Parliament wasn't true, because I'd accused him of lying. And she said, what he said wasn't true but it wasn't a lie. And I said to Miss Gray, well, what's the difference? She wasn't going to give me a lesson in the English language. I still am not certain what the difference is between lying and not telling the truth. But then
I think they call it misleading Parliament inadvertently, or believing what you're told, or whatever other workaround they've found.
What amused me with it was that because she wasn't going to deal with it and get the minister to retract or resign, I wrote to all of our 1,011 clients and sent them a letter that they might like to sign and send off to Sue Gray. And I gave them her Cabinet Office email address that they could send it to. And she rang me one morning, very angry, and said, how dare I give her email address to all of my clients? Not her personal email address, her office email address. And I said, well, what's your problem? She said, well, I'm going to have to reply to them all. And I said, well, that's not my fault. Just do what you have been asked. And eventually, Robertson did go to the Commons, and he stood up and he said, on whatever date it was, I made a statement to the House. What I said is open to interpretation. And he sat down.
Yeah.
And I called Sue Gray to say, that's not a putting the situation right. And said, that's the best you're going to get.
So after all this, it went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court judgment overall was that the veterans had just left it too late. They agreed with the MOD argument that there wasn't any sort of fresh evidence to prove their case, and that most of them had known at least of a connection between their illnesses and radiation for more than 3 years. And that was that. But they did allow a few to sort of stay on the books that could have proceeded, because they found out much later. They had much later developed cancer, didn't they?
Yeah, well, I would put the Supreme Court decision slightly differently, if you'll excuse me. What they said was that the Court of Appeal had done a very thorough investigation of the scientific evidence, and the scientific evidence was against the veterans. Nothing to do with the limitation as such, but the scientific evidence was against the veterans. And as the Court of Appeal had carried out a thorough investigation, which in my opinion they did not, it was just a whitewash. The 111 odd people who were not subject to limitation, they remain live in any event, and those cases are still live today. But unfortunately, my firm decided we'd already spent enough money on the case. It cost the firm about £7 million. We weren't going to carry on funding another full trial. And we couldn't get litigation funders to back it. So the case just sits there. So the government is not wrong in saying there's a live case. I mean, it's waiting to go into intensive care, but
it's live, but very much on a ventilator and not twitching very much. So we had this situation then, I suppose, with the MOD. They said to veterans, well, this sounds awful. You poor guys, look, if you can find the evidence, then we'll happily sort it out. But they had the evidence all along. They held all the cards. They had the information. They were the ones sifting it. They were the ones controlling access to it and release of it for courts and for other things, for war pensions. The courts believed the MOD lawyers perhaps a little bit more than the claimants. And, 20 years on, Merlin is finally opened. We're finally seeing what you never had at the time. We found the first evidence of blood testing in 2022. We found there on Merlin. Merlin then partially got opened with some blood test results in 2023. The Q jury got involved, and Oli's firm. And then in 2024, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, ordered that Merlin just be open, just declassify it. And it's got to be opened now. And we're going through it all. And while we're doing it with students at uni, Oli, your team have been looking through some of the stuff we found as well. And what do you understand now about the state of Merlin, I suppose, as a result of hearing, obviously speaking to Neil about how he dealt with it at the time and the problems he had, and what we're seeing, what we're actually looking at. How does any of that change or be substantiated?
Well, it just confirms everything that Neil has said, that this is a chaotic, disorganized, random data set that somebody has to sit and go through every single document because it's unsearchable and the mechanism for searching it doesn't work. That renders it as a body of documents for a disclosure exercise effectively useless.
Is that normal in a big disclosure exercise? I'm just trying to, would you have, I suppose, a big public sector organisation or a big organisation that has to disclose a huge amount of documents, maybe even sensitive documents, that it would be a bit of a slog with anyone?
I'm sure that's the case, and there would be a bit of leeway, but this almost, and I say almost because we're lawyers, but almost it appears that by design, the database is unusable and unsearchable. I think part of the main sort of issue, or one of the key issues that we're coming across, which is a good example of this as well, is that it seems that a number of documents or PDFs would be put together into one PDF and then labeled under a label if it's lucky enough to have a label, and then given some keywords attached to it if it's lucky enough to have some keywords attached to it. But that document could contain 3 PDFs that have been found under the sofa that are all related to different things. And so what we're finding sometimes is at the back of a document, which is apparently about something else, there is appended to that something which is about something totally different that you wouldn't know that was there, you wouldn't be able to search for, you wouldn't be able to identify as part of any disclosure exercise.
So how is the state, is the state that Merlin is in, is it helping or hindering what McHugh Jury is having to do today, pick up the baton that Rosenblatt and Neil started running with so many years ago? There
are parts of it and its release which are helpful. And the work that I know that you guys are doing with Liverpool University is a big slog and is very much appreciated at our end. And certainly we are now coming across documents which we can, wave in the government's face and say, and look at this and look at this. But it's 28,000 documents. It's hundreds of thousands or millions of pages which are being released drip by drip into the National Archives when many of these men have 5 years left, if they're lucky. In a sense, in that sense, I think it's partly almost a red herring at this point. The government need to park saying, oh, you guys can go through Merlin now, tell us what you find, because it's simply not feasible in the time remaining. What they need to do is they need to engage properly with these veterans, engage properly with their claims, and settle them. That's what we've been asking for, a tribunal which has the power to compel witnesses to find out what actually happened and to settle claims. That kind of thing now has to happen at a fast-track process because we simply don't have the time to spend, or the veterans don't have the time to spend, 5 years going through everything that they release. Some of the stuff that we have been able to do with Merlin now, although you can't search it very easily, when we do get a tip about something, as we did about a recent report about exposure and fallout on inhabited areas at Christmas Island, which we'll discuss in a different episode, you can then go reverse engineer it, go back into Merlin and start looking for stuff that corroborates it and trying to think around how they would have tagged it and going, well, where would they have, they said there was radioactive fish, so let's look at environmental data that mentions fish and start. You're still doing a bit of a trawl, but it's a smaller trawl and it can be a little bit more focused. The disclosure of Merlin, has it actually changed the veterans' legal position, or are they, I think they would want to know, are they still as stymied as ever by the fact the MOD controlled this whole thing? Well, yes and no. The difference now is that because of that process that you say, where we have been able to identify documents, go track them down and try to corroborate points, is that we have been able to say to the government, look, this document shows that what Neil and what you have been saying all along about Merlin is correct. That it was disorganized, that it didn't work, and that we weren't able to properly present the case. And that in the last couple of years has led to movement at the centre of government. We've had the missing medical records review. We've had the, of which we're expecting the much delayed result, in the next 30 days. We've had the announcement of an investigation into the whistleblower report that was recently released about the change in the government's position in 2014 that the government then suppressed and didn't do anything with. It feels like there has been a recognition at the heart of government that something went deeply wrong here and that something needs to be done to remedy it. Then, in classic fashion, we have a new government. So we need to wait and see what we're going to get out of this government. But as you know, Susie, Mr. Burnham came with us last year, it was around this time last year, to hand in a police file to the Metropolitan Police at New Scotland Yard. He was the only MP to turn up that day, or he wasn't an MP, he was the only politician to turn up that day. We have pictures of him there. We've got
video of him there.
We've got video of him there. We're going to hold him to the fact that we had an issue with the other politicians, Keir Starmer, people like that, where they paid lip service to the test veterans. They would meet with them in opposition because it was an important campaign. But when they then got into power, they weren't really interested. Andy has been right at the heart of this campaign for several years now. So I am hopeful that he will engage with us properly and we'll be able to resolve this.
Yeah. Keir Starmer, to his credit, did actually authorise, or John Healey, his defence secretary, did authorise the release of Merlin. So that's something that is of use. But like you say, it's a bit of a red herring, and it's almost offensive to release, I think, about 750,000 or 1 million pages of documents and tell men who have an average age of 85 and a range of chronic health conditions, well, go and pick the sweet corn out of that, lads, see if what you can find.
And it's not what they're asking for either.
No.
It's can we find out what really happened? Can we set up a process to do that? And can we have compensation where it's deserved? And instead it's, what about, here are 28,000 documents? It's a mechanism of saying, look, we're doing something without actually properly engaging with what we want the response to do.
A bit like the disclosure exercise in the first place, Neil, when they dumped 12,000 documents on you and went, there you go, swim through that and see what you can do.
And then they turn up to the court and say, oh, look, we've given them 12,000 documents. It's a classic playbook. Yeah.
Now, they eventually, like I said, went to Supreme Court. There was a few people who still have a right to proceed, although it never went anywhere. But the MOD played a bit of a blinder here, didn't they, Neil? Their strategy all the way through, the fighting the limitation case, dumping you with paperwork, insisting you go through developed vetting. They managed to actually do what they would have wanted to do, which was push it so far into the long grass, there's no earthly prospect really of it coming back. At the same time, the government has managed to do a big trawl of all the possible paperwork that might get them in trouble in Whitehall, and they've put it behind this lovely big perimeter fence marked national security where no one can get to it. And even if you do get to it, as we have now, it's a haphazard mess. And whoever came up with any of this as a wheeze is absolute genius working for the government. But I know you were under a huge amount of pressure during all this time, because you, like Oli does now, and like me, you both feel a degree of personal responsibility and strain about what's happened with the veterans. And even though it's 20 years ago and you're retired now, you still give a good God down, don't you?
Absolutely. My wife says it was this case that gave me a heart attack many years ago, but I'm still completely behind the veterans. And the biggest issue, which the government has not explained, forgetting all of the documents, all of the disclosure, everything else, every other nuclear power in the world has paid compensation to its servicemen who took part in their tests. And they've all accepted servicemen who were at the tests were exposed to radiation, and different countries have different lists of diseases that they accept. If you have Disease A or B, you're entitled to compensation. Disease C, perhaps not. Why does the British government say nobody was exposed to radiation and nobody has suffered? It's a very simple question that the government doesn't answer. And I don't know how to ask the question or to whom the question should be asked to get an answer. And the only answer that can be given is it was all too expensive. We didn't want to pay out the money. And just perhaps whoever gets into 10 Downing Street in 2.5 weeks' time or whenever it is, just might have the ability to say, previous governments were wrong. We accept what every other nuclear power in the world has done and compensate our veterans. I mean, the big fear is that it will cost billions upon billions of pounds. But I don't think that the veterans are really looking for money. They just want an acknowledgement. I mean, yes, they do want some compensation. Shouldn't say they don't. But they want an acknowledgement as to what happened and why they were injured or how were they injured.
Yeah,
and somebody needs to ask the question. You won't get a straight answer from the government.
Yeah, I think to a lot of them, the compensation is the concrete proof of an apology, rather than it being about money or anything else.
That's right.
It's truth more than anything else, which is what the court case you fought initially was for.
That's right. Well, I put it that we're British. We have nice nuclear bombs. We don't have they don't produce radiation because we're gentlemen and we don't do that.
No, or they produce radiation to other people. Other people need to be frightened of our bombs, but they don't hurt our own side because we drink tea and have cheese sandwiches, and that somehow protects you from the effects of radiation. Ah, dear.
There were suggestions originally, I think, of doing that. They wanted to do the tests in Scotland, I think, and there were a number of British-based sites that were considered for the tests, and it was decided, no, let's do it further away, which again I think is evidence that they knew before any bomb was ever exploded, they knew there was going to be trouble.
Yeah, you can't get further away from Whitehall than Christmas Island in the Pacific or Maralinga and Emu Field in the outback. You can't get more isolated. You can't get further away from the people making the decisions without actually coming all the way back round the globe towards them again. That's as far as you can go on this planet. That's where they did it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for taking us through all that. You haven't been remotely technical. You've been perfectly clear for a non-lawyer audience about how all this works. Hopefully we're getting a bit nearer the truth now and some kind of legal result where perhaps the law will actually manage to push this through to the right conclusion in the end. We'll have to wait and see, won't we? Thank you both very much for your time. Next time, dear listener, we're going to be talking to some politicians about the injustice, how they've been working in Parliament, that fallout report and the whistleblower who came forward. And also we're going to be looking into British service personnel who are used in French and Chinese weapons testing, hopefully. So do come back and tune in another time. Thanks very much, everyone. This podcast series is part of the Nuclear Justice Research Project based at the University of Liverpool. Funded by Research England's Policy Fund, the project is a collaboration between the Centre for People's Justice and the Department of History, investigative reporter Susie Boniface and LabRats International. All historic images are Crown copyright and reproduced under the Open Government Licence. With thanks to Dr. Jonathan Hogg, Susie Boniface, Sarah Jane Stroud, Michael Bayliss and the team of students.